1932, the year the family lost the farm. The Hendrickson family story was rooted in the unforgiving soil of rural western Kentucky. Their life was defined by the pervasive poverty and indignity of sharecropping. The Great Depression was not merely an event for them, it was a perpetual state of existence, marked by cyclical foreclosure and loss. The family narrative was perpetually scarred by one memory in particular. Great-grandfather P.K. Hendrickson lost his 205-acre farm between 1932 and 1933. The loss occurred over a meager $148.33 in unpaid taxes. This harsh environment demanded strict discipline and relentless physical hardship for survival. It instilled a fierce work ethic, but it also contributed to a complex, dark legacy. Violence and anger were passed down through the generations. Joseph Paul Hendrickson knew this hardship intimately. He was born in October 1918, during the height of the great influenza epidemic. His childhood was one of constant displacement. The family was forced onto properties like the Wathen and Will Tom Wathen farms. Their homes were rudimentary and sparse. Coal oil lanterns provided the only dim light in darkened rooms. A wood-burning stove was the sole source of heat against the biting winter cold. It was fed with fine crushed coal, carefully banked to hold the fire overnight. His days were spent in grueling manual labor. He picked corn by hand in sweltering hayfields. This was often followed by lessons at the one-room schoolhouse called Seven Gums. Disobedience was met with harsh paternal discipline. This ingrained pattern of physical punishment left lasting psychological marks. Yet, within this rigid life, Joe Paul's father maintained a few non-negotiable standards. His children always wore shoes. Sundays were strictly reserved for church and rest. Even on those days, however, driven by an intrinsic need, he would walk the corn rows just to see things grow. A pivotal, almost divine moment of clarity occurred around 1932. Joe Paul was then 14 or 15 years old. He stood in the dust of the farm when a Ford trimotor airplane flew directly overhead. The terrible roar of the engine and the huge sudden shadow darkening the earth ignited something profound within him. It was a vision of escape. It was a dream of flight that stood in stark contrast to his grounded reality. He had left the farm forever. He had left the farm forever. He enlisted in the Army Air Corps at age 19 on November 16th. The military offered the only viable path to a different life. The looming threat of global war in early 1941 provided the backdrop for his courtship with Rita Bernardine. They met at the Xenia roller rink. The acceleration of world events rapidly compressed their timeline. Their commitment was solidified by the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941. This led to their marriage in February 1942. Joe Paul was 23 and Rita was barely 19. They were immediately swept into a whirlwind of military assignments and frequent transfers. These assignments moved them through 14 towns in 30 months. Joe Paul's initial service was grounded in mechanics. He trained as an airplane mechanic and graduated from propeller school. He rose through the ranks as a crew chief, earning various mechanic ratings. But the grease pits were only a stepping stone toward his true objective. His heart belonged to the sky, and endeavored by a force of will and a certainty in self, crucial for overcoming his systemic disadvantages. He wanted to become both an officer and a pilot. This call to duty was not unique in his lineage. Joe Paul's decision to enlist and pursue combat mirrored a deep, inherited burden of service. 83 years earlier, his great-great-grandfather, George Hendrickson, had mustered in. He enlisted on December 31, 1861, at age 26. George, fighting with the 13th Kentucky, faced his first terrifying test under fire. It happened at the Battle of Shiloh on April 7, 1862. Under sheeting rain, George's regiment poured in a heavy fire on the enemy's lines. They endured heavy fire with shot and shell and suffered significant casualties. Just as George had been tested in the bloody mud of Shiloh, Joe Paul was facing his own trial. Propelled by the urgent need for aviators, he was rapidly entering a new, technologically advanced theater of combat. He was determined to break free from the poverty of his youth. The Army Air Corps, with its promise of flight, became the engine of his transcendence. Had traded the shovel and the coal oil lamp for the complex machinery of war. He was finally ready to take his place in the sky. 1942, early spring. The relentless bombing campaign over London by Hitler's Luftwaffe hammered home an urgent existential truth for the Allies. The age of daylight air superiority was rapidly yielding to the necessity of night warfare. The US Army Air Forces needed a specialized machine immediately. They did not want a converted bomber, but a dedicated night interceptor. This aircraft had to be capable of distinguishing enemy aircraft in absolute blackness. This strategic demand led to the development of the P-61 Black Widow. It was an all-metal, twin-engine, twin-boom pursuit plane. It was a sleek and lethal thing, equipped with state-of-the-art radar technology. Its SCR-720 microwave radar dish was housed in its nose. This technology was the cutting edge of the war. It transformed night flying from blind hunting into a guided deadly pursuit. Joseph Paul Hendrickson was now fully immersed in the process of becoming a flyer. He was still driven by the childhood awe of the Ford Trimotor that had once shadowed his Kentucky farm. After his commissioning as a second lieutenant in March 1942, his training accelerated rapidly. He began at Thunderbird Field 2 in Scottsdale, Arizona. There he wrestled the PT-13 Stearman biplane through primary training. He could feel the wind in his face in the open cockpit. From there, he moved to basic training in Bakersfield, California. This was followed by advanced twin-engine instruction. He flew AT-9, AT-17 and AT-19 aircraft at Yuma Army Airfield. On June 22, 1943, he received his silver wings. Rita was present to witness the culmination of his ambition. It was during his transition to B-25 Mitchells in La Junta, Colorado, that he made a fateful decision. He combined a yearning for continued stateside service near his growing family. He also held an innate desire for personal challenge. He volunteered for night fighter training. This high-stakes hybrid role required mastery of complex radar systems and blind landings. The training regimen proved to be grueling. It moved him through high and low altitude flight in total darkness across Florida. He trained in Orlando, Kissimmee, Dunelon, and Ocala. Training then centralized at Hammer Field in Fresno, California. This was the hub for the 481st Night Fighter Operational Training Group. Before he could strap into the sophisticated Black Widow, he had to master interim aircraft. These included the A-20 Havoc and the P-70. The P-70 was a converted night fighter that was inherently difficult to handle. These early stages were fraught with constant danger. On August 8, 1944, the danger became real. During gunnery practice over Muroc Lake, California, the hydraulic system on his P-70 failed. He and his radio observer, Lieutenant Jack H. Kerr, faced the terrifying prospect of a crash landing. With no time to spare, Hendrickson brought the crippled aircraft in. He landed at full throttle on the soft lakebed. The resulting skid was violent but ultimately controlled. It was a testament to his burgeoning skill as a pilot. The squadron report, employing the minimizing language typical of the war effort, simply logged it as a successful forced landing. The incident, however, underscored the ever-present threat of mechanical failure in the nascent world of night aviation. Meanwhile, life for Rita was defined by continuous upheaval and quiet resilience. After their marriage and his early assignments, their first son, Marty, was born.
Marty was born in El Centro, California, on December 28, 1942.
Rita navigated the constant transfers. She often relied on the support of her parents in Xenia, Ohio. Sometimes, she traveled with other pilots' wives, such as Edie Kessler. These journeys were arduous. They were marked by bumpy wartime roads and the indignity of cheap housing. She often made do with hot plates in cramped motel rooms. The anxiety surrounding Joseph's deployment was palpable even before he earned his wings. His mother-in-law, Nonna, was fiercely protective. In 1942, Nonna penned a passionate letter to Eleanor Roosevelt. She pleaded for him to be kept stateside due to Rita's pregnancy. The official reply was swift and cold. It stated that no assurance could be given for his continued duties within the United States. By May 1, 1949, the 549th Night Fighter Squadron, or NFS, was officially activated. The strategic focus of the war had shifted entirely to the Pacific Theater. This shift was driven by the need to secure island bases. Crucially, it was also necessary to protect the massive B-29 Superfortress bombers. The B-29s were the only aircraft capable of delivering long-range strikes against the Japanese mainland. These bombers, flying from bases in the Marianas, were highly vulnerable to Japanese night interceptors. The 549th was formed specifically to counter this deadly threat. The time for training was now over. On September 20th, 1944, Joseph and Rita shared a poignant and heroic goodbye in Amarillo, Texas. He and fellow flyer Lieutenant Charlie Kessler accompanied their wives eastward. They then boarded a troopship bound for the Pacific. The squadron's aircraft were shipped separately. This included the P-61 he would eventually name the Rita B after his wife. The deployment moved the 549th from the relative safety of stateside training. They first stopped at Kipapa Airfield in Oahu, Hawaii. Then, they moved onward to the active combat theater. This deployment placed Joseph Paul Hendrickson, the sharecropper's son, squarely in the high-stakes world of Pacific night warfare. He was 5 weeks shy of his 26th birthday. He carried the weight of his lineage and his family's future into the dark skies. The strategic imperative for the invasion of Iwo Jima was absolute. It was driven by the relentless, long-range demands of the Pacific Air War. American B-29 Superfortress bombers were flying thousands of miles from bases in the Marianas. They needed to strike the Japanese mainland. They desperately needed Iwo Jima as an emergency landing strip and a refueling hub. Crucially, they needed it as a forward radar warning station to detect enemy interceptors. The operation was initially framed by optimists as a pushover. It was expected to be secured in just 4 days. The reality, however, was a brutal 5-week siege. The siege cost the Americans 27,000 casualties. It redefined the meaning of entrenched warfare. The Japanese defense was orchestrated by General Tadamichi Kuribayashi. He was a man whose complex humanity defied the typical portrayal of the faceless enemy. Kuribayashi had toured America as a military attaché in 1928. He possessed an intimate understanding of the American military psyche. He knew that conventional tactics would lead only to suicide. Defying his superiors' wishes for glorious, doomed banzai charges, he ordered his men underground. He meticulously constructed an extensive network of gaseous and suffocating caves, bunkers, and underground tunnels. This strategy transformed the 9-square-mile island into an impenetrable fortress. Even as he prepared for certain death, Kuribayashi wrote tenderly to his family. He shared mundane details of life on the distant scrap of sulphurous sand. He worried about their happiness. He even drew a squirrel for his young son, Taro. This was a testament to the loving mundane of a man who saw himself as the emperor's reluctant warrior. By the time the 549th Night Fighter Squadron arrived on March 20, 1945, the illusion of a quick victory had been completely shattered. They landed on South Field. Joseph Hendrickson and his fellow airmen came ashore to confront the stark aftermath of the brutal battle. The black sand beaches were littered with wrecked ships and landing craft. The air, even before the fighting began, reeked of sulfur. The island was a scene of extraordinarily violent death. The pilots quickly realized that the Japanese were not simply on Iwo Jima, they were, quite literally, in Iwo Jima. The enemy was hidden within 5,000 caves and 13,000 miles of tunnels. The airmen set up their temporary camp in immediate proximity to the carnage. They staked squad tents into the sand. They relied on makeshift latrines and sulfur wells for water. The 549th's mission was to fly hazardous intruder missions. They flew over the nearby Japanese-held Bonin Islands. Their primary targets were Chichi-jima and Ha-ha-jima. They sought out enemy aircraft and bombed strategic installations. It was on one of these early missions, on April 11, 1945, that Lieutenant Hendrickson faced his most terrifying moment. He was flying the P-61 Black Widow, affectionately named the Rita B. He and his radar operator Jack Kerr were over Chichi-jima when they were suddenly caught in blinding enemy searchlights. The night instantly became a living hell. Hendrickson felt the chilling certainty that the lights were radar-controlled. They were locked into the crosshairs of intense whistling ack-ack fire. He slammed the throttles forward. He redlined the heavy aircraft at over 425 miles per hour. He dove violently toward the water, weaving desperately to break the lock of the lights. The maneuver was successful. He pulled the P-61 out of the kill zone by mere feet. The psychological toll, however, was immense. He landed back on Iwo Jima shaking so violently he could barely function for a week. His fear immediately curdled into explosive frustration. He stormed into the head intelligence officer's tent. They were screaming that they needed to get their act together before they got some of their pilots killed. He felt intensely that the bastards had screwed them on their intelligence, that intelligence had promised a clear run. Yet, when the official mission report was filed, the terrifying, near-fatal encounter was completely erased. It was summarized only by the minimizing language of the war effort. The report claimed they encountered no anti-aircraft fire or searchlights. This stark contradiction between the visceral, personal terror and the detached bureaucratic record underscored a deep disconnect. It highlighted the difference between the men who fought the war and those who wrote its history. The greatest shock for the 549th, however, occurred after the island was prematurely declared secure. On March 26, 1945, around 4 a.m., Kuribayashi's last, most meticulously planned action commenced. A final contingent of 300 to 600 Japanese soldiers launched a kirikomi attack. The term kirikomi means a cutting or severing. This attack targeted the American positions, including the newly established airfields. The quiet of the pre-dawn darkness was instantaneously shattered. They heard screaming and the metallic shriek of bayonets slashing through canvas tents. Grenades rolled across the dirt floors. The blasts jolted Joseph Hendrickson and his squadron mates awake. They woke to the whistling of bullets and the screams of the wounded. This final desperate stand occurred when the airmen believed the worst of the ground fighting was over. It shattered the squadron's fragile sense of safety. The brutal, close-quarters violence inflicted significant casualties. 6 enlisted men were killed in action. 9 men were evacuated, 4 of them severely wounded. The attack was a final, visceral reminder. It proved that on Iwo Jima, the enemy never truly surrendered. The war's end was a torturous, personal affair. It was fought tent by tent, not just mile by mile. General Kuribayashi yielded the island in his final telegrams. He acknowledged the battle's final chapter and the loss of the imperial land. He left behind a legacy of resistance. His legacy ensured the cost of victory would be felt long after the flags were raised. The psychological burden of war was not merely the stress of being shot at, it was the moral calculus imposed by command, the necessity of committing acts that twisted the soul. In June 1945, as the war was finding its torturous close, Lieutenant Joseph Paul Hendrickson received an order that would haunt him for the rest of his life. AB-29 Superfortress, a ghost ship returning from a mission, was crippled. It was flying with 2 engines out, and tragically several dead airmen aboard. The plane was a hazard, a potential navigational threat to other returning aircraft. Joseph and his wingman, Lieutenant Maxwell Julian, known as Pinky, were ordered to destroy it. Joseph flew the Black Widow alongside the massive bomber, making passes at the wounded machine. He knew, with chilling certainty, that even if some crew members were dead, others might be alive. They could be trapped inside, hoping for a miracle landing. He described his voice growing soft and incredulous decades later. He recalled how the B-29 stubbornly kept going until he finally destroyed it. The explosion sent it plunging into the ocean. But the image that sticks to me, my mind is, those dead men on board, he admitted. It was a burden that bothered me ever since. This necessary evil of war left a permanent ragged scar on his conscience. He had followed his orders, but the trauma of execution was his alone. The dangers of military aviation were unrelenting, extending beyond direct enemy engagement. On May 5, 1945, on Saipan, Joseph was preparing for takeoff in the Rita B. He was with his radar observer, Lieutenant Jack H. Kerr, and gunner, Staff Sergeant Leo E. Vau.
In a terrifying instant, a propeller came slicing through the cockpit glass.
Whether due to mechanical failure or ground debris, the blade narrowly missed the pilot's neck and back. Only the thickness of his heavy flying suit prevented a fatal injury. The near-death experience was so profound that for a time, Joseph lost his nerve for flying. He reportedly refused to re-enter the cockpit, an act that could have resulted in a court-martial.
Instead of succumbing to trauma, he channeled his energy into building morale.
He contributed to the construction of the officers' club and an outdoor theatre. This physical distraction offered temporary relief from the psychological shock of his close call. Even as the war machine wound down, the killing continued. On July 31, 1945, just weeks before VJ Day, the squadron lost one of its finest. Larry Garland, the ablest flyer and former Yale athlete, along with his crew, inexplicably nosedived into the ocean near Iwo Jima. Only a wing surfaced from the wreckage. The agonizing delay in notification meant that their families did not receive official confirmation of their loss until August 22, 1945. This was long after the nation had erupted in collective ecstatic celebration of victory. The tragedy underscored the vulnerability of every pilot and the senseless brutality of a conflict. It claimed life even as the ink dried on the surrender documents. Finally, the war found its close. Joseph departed Iwo Jima on September 23, 1945. He officially separated from the military on October 26. The journey home was long. It was marked by the profound shift from the constant life-or-death intensity of combat to the quiet absurdity of civilian life. For many veterans, the return was not a seamless reintegration. It was a disconnect from their former lives. As one comrade wrote in a letter, the ideas they had about post-war life had rarely panned out. They imagined the ease of acquiring a car or the simple act of finding a girlfriend. The heroes were back, but the world they returned to felt small and strange. This dissonance was never more apparent than on Thanksgiving, November 22, 1945. It was a day of mandated national gratitude. But for the men returning, it was the quiet beginning of the struggle to get back down on the ground. The food was hot, and the family was whole. Yet the weight of Iwo Jima, the terror of the searchlights, and the moral stain of the B-29 incident were carried inward, unspoken. Joseph, the pilot who had once been the emperor of the air, was now simply a husband and father that was trying to inhabit a life devoid of the implicit threat of physical danger. But the war had not left him. The combat stress and the internalized fear manifested as undiagnosed post-traumatic stress disorder. The discipline learned in the harsh Kentucky fields, coupled with the trauma of the Pacific, created an often explosive and arbitrary temper. The brave pilot of the Rita B transformed in the domestic sphere into a figure who inflicted fear. He used a belt and boards for discipline, leaving lasting marks on his sons Marty and Rick. This duality, the courageous aviator versus the father who ruled with fear, became the central, aching mystery of his sons' childhoods. The sharecropper's son had escaped the poverty of the land. However, he had carried the legacy of violence, amplified by the psychological scars of war, home to his family. The emotional ties to his roots and the trauma of his service remained profound. They cast a long shadow over the peace he had risked his life to secure. The complexity of Joseph Paul Hendrickson's post-war life created a central, unresolved tension in the life of his son, the author. This duality of the brave aviator and the stern, often explosive father was agonizing. For years, the son's memory of his father was colored by the fear and resentment born of harsh, arbitrary discipline. The father, the man who had soared above Iwo Jima, had ruled his home with a belt and boards. He left psychological imprints that felt as profound as any physical scar. This pattern established a deep emotional chasm. It was a silence that war veterans often maintained regarding their trauma. The son, as an adult, carried this silence as a heavy, unarticulated burden. By the late 1980s, the son found himself in a midlife crisis. He was professionally adrift and financially strained. The pressure culminated over New Year's 1987 in a torrent of bottled-up emotion. He wrote a 7-page letter, raw and accusatory. It confessed his perceived failures while projecting the blame onto his parents. It was a desperate, angry attempt to force a confrontation that had been avoided for decades. The father's response was immediate and surprising. His 1-page reply was not the rigid, dismissive rebuke the son expected. Instead, it was an emotional counterpoint, questioning the accusations and revealing his own deep hurt. It was the first true crack in the father's stoic armor. It marked the beginning of a slow, fragile process of reconciliation. A year later, around Memorial Day weekend in 1988, the father sought to bridge the gap. He did so in the only way he truly knew how, through shared experience in the air. They organized a fly-in fishing trip to Canada. The father, now an airline captain, still possessed the inherent need for speed and the absolute certainty in self. The certainty had driven him from the Kentucky cornfields into the cockpit of the P-61. He piloted them through sleeting weather. He navigated treacherous skies with the same unflappable skill he had once used to reedline the Black Widow away from Japanese ack fire. For the son, watching his father command the aircraft was revelatory. That watched him make a snap decision to take a spontaneous detour to Texas just for the hell of it. It was to witness the Emperor of the Air in his natural element. His father was independent, powerful, and utterly in control. This shared journey, removed from the fraught domestic context, allowed the son to appreciate the immense competence and enduring passion for flight that defined his father's existence. The son's quest for understanding required more than just shared moments. It demanded history. He began a painstaking archival search to understand the unknowable father. He needed to fill the hole in the middle of his father's story. This hole represented the unquantifiable, unwritten part of his Iwo Jima experience and its aftermath. The research was fraught with bureaucratic challenges. Notably, the devastating fire in 1973 at the National Personnel Records Center complicated the search. This fire had destroyed thousands of service files, including many from the Army Air Forces. Miraculously, his father's file was retrieved, as preservation felt like a divine intervention. It compelled the author to write the book. The records often provided more questions than answers. The son discovered declassified mission reports, which he considered ingots of gold. These documents detailed the 549th Night Fighter Squadron's activities. However, these official accounts often starkly contradicted his father's visceral personal testimony. Mission Report Number 4-9, for example, used detached clinical language. It detailed the observation of unexplained lights near Takinora town. The report noted that Lieutenant Jack Kerr counted 6 lights in a horseshoe shape. This was the exact mission the father remembered only through the profound lens of fear. His memory was of being tracked and nearly killed by searchlights and ack fire. The son hypothesized that the squadron and the 7 Fighter Command historians might have been protecting each other. They engaged in a papering over language for the sake of the historical record. The author's journey to uncover his father's history was a parallel search for his father's hidden emotional life that previously sought to understand the humanity of General Kuribayashi, the enemy who drew squirrels for his son. Now he was seeking the humanity hidden behind his own father's stern facade. The trauma carried home by his father's flightmate and godfather Jack Kerr provided another clue. Kerr died in 1997. The pain his godfather carried home from the war had an emotional residue, a capillary oozing. This residue left a large sorrow and deep estrangement in his family. It was a chapter not written in the official histories. This demonstrated that the psychological wounds of war extended far beyond the battlefield, bled into the very fabric of family life for an entire generation. The father's physical decline forced the final confrontation with mortality. In 1994, a quadruple bypass ended his solo flying career. Further health crises followed, including an emergency heart surgery in 1996. By 2001, he and his son took a final trip together to Kitty Hawk. They reflected on the birthplace of flight and their shared finite time. In March 2003, the father called his son from Atlanta. His discipline was ingrained to the last. He stated plainly, "Paul, it's time for me to leave the earth." When a tumor was discovered in mid-April, he accepted the diagnosis. It was the stoic resignation of a man receiving his final orders. During these final years, the hardened veteran revealed his hidden vulnerabilities. He admitted to suffering from claustrophobia. He expressed regret about not attending college. In a moment that shattered decades of emotional distance, he looked at his son. He tearfully admitted, "Look at me, damn baby." The pilot who had flown the P-61 and later the Beechcraft Debonair was a symbol of independence and power. Now he was reduced to a frail man. He was surrounded by medical paraphernalia that resembled a makeshift cockpit. As a journey, moving from childhood terror to adult understanding, allowed the son to finally release his resentments. These resentments had long defined their relationship. He came to appreciate the true cost of his father's sacrifices. This appreciation implicitly challenged the romanticized narrative of the greatest generation. Joseph Paul Hendrickson was not a mythic hero. He was a complex man, driven by internal ambition. He was scarred by moral imperatives, such as the order to shoot down the crippled B-29, as experiences manifested as explosive anger. They led to a lifelong struggle to get back down on the ground. The P-61 Black Widow rendered on his gravestone was a powerful symbol. It symbolized not just bravery, but the immense, enduring psychological weight he carried home. This trauma was a legacy passed down through the generations. It was a legacy finally understood through the painstaking power of memory and personal narrative. If you value these historical accounts, please subscribe to the channel and like this video. It helps us preserve these stories. And please, share your own memories or thoughts in the comments below.